Hello board game brothers and sisters, I'm Adam Singer and welcome to another episode where I'll be letting you know of all the board games launching on Kickstarter and GameFound over the next week. If you're new here, we do this every single week going over all the upcoming campaigns, so if you want to stay up to date, this is the place to be. But before we get started, I do like to go over some news and announcements. And I'll just get the easy one out of the way here first, and that's that there's a new campaign announced from the publisher Into the Unknown, and this is the same team that brought you Aeon Trespass Odyssey, and it looks like they're going to be bringing another giant dungeon crawler into the mix here. I don't know if this is going to be quite as big as Aeon Trespass Odyssey, but this one's going to have a very different theme because this one's actually going to be taking place in space, and it says here that this is the cosmic love child of aliens, Lovecraft, and a touch of Star Wars. I'm sure there's a lot more there to dig into, but I didn't look into this too much more than what I've just explained to you, so if you do want to check this one out, they do have their pre-launch page up on Kickstarter now, and of course you can get notified if you do want to follow along with it. Other than that, I did want to give a quick mention to a paper that was just written about the board game industry, and what's interesting about this one is that it was actually written by someone local to my area, and they took the time to interview myself as well as some other people in this region, including Chris George and Joe Slack. And there is a lot here, but I did read a fair amount of it, and I think it was really well done, and there's a lot of interesting information in here, so if you are interested in the board game industry, you can go through any of the sections here and take a look at the ones that might interest you. And of course, if you are just interested to see what I had to say or what anyone else had to say in these interviews, you can always do a quick text search for our names through the article and just see what we had to say. Serena asked some really good questions, and I even had fun just going through them over again, especially since it was quite a long time since that interview, so I didn't even really remember what was asked, but going through it again, it was cool to see what answers I came up with, and they actually weren't that bad. If you do want to check this one out and show it some love, I will have a link to it in the description below. Other than that, I do like to give a quick mention to Alex over at Board Game Co. as well as Michael at Zilla Blitz, because we do all work together keeping track of all these upcoming campaigns. I put out these videos every single week, but Alex will have you covered with a video at the start of each month, going over the heavy hitters for that month and letting you know of what you can expect. Mike focuses pretty much exclusively on historical war games, which is a genre that both Alex and I don't cover in as much detail, so if you do want the whole comprehensive view of what's to come, you definitely want to follow him as well, and he does also track other crowdfunding platforms that offer these games exclusively. But we do have another crazy week with a crazy amount of games launching, so that's everything for an intro. Let's check them out. And the first campaign we have launches on September 30th, and this one is called Era of Atlantis. And this one is a really interesting area control game where you're going to be using either your military might or your political influence in order to gain control of different areas and try to score the most victory points at the end of the game. But what's really interesting about this game is that each player is going to have their own set of units that they'll be able to put out onto the board in order to gain influence there. But the thing that makes this interesting is that you're also able to control two other nations, and there's going to be a bunch of different nations out on the board, but you're going to be able to control a specific two of them, and the other players will also be controlling a specific two, but there is overlap between them, meaning that one of your nations is going to be shared with another player, and your other nation is going to be shared with a different player. And there are ways that you can score victory points just for yourself, but between these two nations, you're going to be gaining victory points equal to the influence of the nation that has the lower influence. So you do want to try and raise them both, but you want to try to raise them both as evenly as possible so that you're not giving too many victory points potentially to someone else, while also making sure that one of your nations doesn't fall too far behind because that's the one that you're going to be scoring. But the game plays over a series of rounds with each player getting one turn per round, and on your turn you're going to be taking actions using action movement. If you're not familiar with that, it means that you're going to have an action board, you're going to have a few pawns on that board, and you'll be able to move that pawn from its current location to a different location in order to take that associated action. The catch here is that you can't put your pawn on a location that already has a pawn, and you also can't put it on the space that you moved it from. But these actions can allow you to gain gold or maybe pay that gold in order to deploy or relocate units out on the board, or you can also use those actions in order to try and take over vacant areas on the board where you have at least one of your units. If you do that and you have enough strength in the region, with each region having a minimum specific amount of strength, then you can just go ahead and take control of it unless there is another player located there or if another player is currently in control of it. If that's the case, then you're going to be taking the strength from the units that you have there, but then each player involved is going to be going through a blind bidding phase where you're going to be taking your dial and then bidding up to the amount of gold that you have, because the amount you bid is the amount of gold that you're going to be sacrificing. Because there are also some loose alliances in this game, depending on who you share a faction with, you might be interested in another player winning or losing a battle, and when you do contribute your strength to a battle, you can decide whether you want to contribute that strength to the defending side or to the attacking side. There is also an action you can perform to just jump into combat without trying to take over a region, and there is some benefits to that, but for the most part, it does follow that same flow. You might have also noticed that there are some buildings located out in these different regions, and that is another action that you can take if you do have the gold in order to build those, and you can pay in order to do that. And that's going to be giving you some sort of benefit, whether it's victory points or additional strength in that region. As players are playing, there's going to be a few tracks that are moving and some different timers that can trigger the end of the game. And then at that point, it's the player who has the most overall victory points that wins the game. And if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. And launching on October 1st, we have Aetherspire, and this one's a cooperative game where players are going to be working together in order to build a tower following different requirements, building that out of tiles and components in order to try and defeat several different bosses. I did already cover this one a couple weeks ago, but I got pushed back until now, so I'll just go ahead and roll that previous footage for you now. The game provides a bunch of different bosses to choose from, but at the start of the game, players are going to be taking one boss of each elemental type, and then shuffling those together and then distributing them face down on the right-hand side of the board here. The bosses don't do anything while they're face down, but players are going to be moving a token down this track as they move through the rounds in the game, and anytime that the token reaches a spot that's connected to a boss card, that boss card is going to be flipped right side up, and then whatever negative effect is outlined on that card is going to be in play until the players defeat that boss. Luckily, each player also gets to choose their own character at the start of the game, with each character having special abilities that can help you along the way, and then the game just plays over a series of rounds as players try to build those towers to try and defeat those enemies. And you can see the main board here has a few different outlined areas where you're going to be building those towers. And there's a few different things that you do on your turn. The first thing you're going to be doing is drawing a floor tile from any of the available stacks. And this doesn't allow you to build that right away, but instead it's going to be putting it into a shared supply that you will be able to build from later by using your actions. You're then going to draw 3 resources from the resource bag, and then you're just going to be putting it in the shared pool in the top left corner of the board. And these resources just represent different elements, and you'll be able to combine them in different ways in order to take some bonus actions. But until then, they just remain in the pool here, and then you're going to be rolling 5 of the action dice. These dice are going to have different icons on them that you're going to be able to spend to perform some basic actions. These actions could be to build one of those tiles from your supply out on the main board, but in order to do this, you do need to meet a few other requirements, with the first one being that certain tiles can only be built upon certain other tiles. And then also you do need to have all the appropriate pillars built before you can build on top of a tile. Building those pillars is one of the other actions that you might be able to perform, and you're doing all of this to try and build a tower of at least 4 floors height, because once you're able to do that, you can actually complete a tower, which allows you to put this cap on the top of it along with one of the elemental crystals. And depending on the type of the elemental crystal that gets put on top of it, you're going to be removing the boss that matches that elemental type. But the benefits don't stop there, because when you do complete a tower, you also get to choose one of the reward tokens that are going to be offered in the game. There's going to be a few on display, and these are going to be some one-time use abilities that will give you some sort of benefit. But aside from the different actions that the dice will offer you, you might also find yourself gaining some different resources of the different elemental types. And like I mentioned before, they do go in this pool here in the top left corner of the board. And what you can also do on your turn is spend any amount of these to activate the different spells on this section of the board. And these can allow you to do things like draw additional tiles, roll additional dice, or even move, destroy, or convert the different invaders into resources. Now, I haven't mentioned the invaders yet, but at the end of your turn, you're going to be moving the token down this track, and this is known as the invader track, because whenever your token moves down this track, not only can it possibly flip one of the boss cards, like I mentioned before, but it's also going to add the number of invaders to the board as indicated in the space where the token moves to. The invaders move into any of the available spaces on your tiles that aren't already occupied by a pillar, which means that they are going to be blocking you from building those pillars until you are able to move them. Not only that, but if there isn't a space for that invader to move into, then instead the players are going to be taking damage. You really don't want this to happen because you only get 2 health in this game, but luckily you can defend from each type of element once. So if you are being attacked by an invader, you really want it to be a different element than one that you've been attacked with previously. But it's important to know that players will also lose the game if the token ever reaches the end of the invader track, but the players win if they're able to build those 4 towers and eliminate all 4 of those bosses. If this one sounds interesting to you, you can go ahead and check it out, and I'll have it linked in the description down below. Also launching on October 1st, we have Quest Snakes, and this one is a competitive game that plays over 2 different phases. The first phase, you're going to be drafting your snakes, creating your party that you're going to be deploying in order to complete different quests. Then after all the players have gathered their full party of 10 snakes, you're going to be moving into the quest phase where you're actually going to be completing those quests. Each of the snakes can have some different strengths and abilities, as well as a cooldown timer that you'll have to wait before you're able to deploy them to another quest. And there is a whole variety of quests that might put limits onto what type or how many snakes you can put into that quest. They could have some special effects or rules, but of course they'll also have some victory points if you are the party that claims victory over that quest. And I do want to thank the publisher here because they were kind enough to send me a copy, so I can just go ahead and show you what this game is like to play. And I do have it set up for a group of 3 players with the 3 different mats here. This is a game that you can set up and get going really quick here because all you got to do is draw 10 quests from the quests offered in the game, and there's a whole bunch of different quests that you can experience, which will give you a lot of variety from game to game. Then you're also going to be creating a deck of 10 snake cards for each player that is going to be playing the game, and there is a whole bunch of those offered in the game as well, which will add some variety depending on player count. Each player also chooses a player board, and you're also going to be starting with the same amount of gold each. This special crown token here just represents which player is currently the active player, and like I said, this game does start with a bidding phase, so we'll jump into that first. As the active player, I'm just going to be drawing 2 cards for each player and then putting them face up on the table for all to see. And then what's going to happen is every player is going to be bidding to get first dibs on these cards, which means if you are the first player to pass, you're going to be getting whichever pair is left over. As I mentioned before, each of these cards are going to have some different stats, with the sword indicating their strength, and then the sundial representing their cooldown time. But if you want to just get a good idea of how good the snake actually is, the level of the snake is outlined in the top left corner, which will give you some idea as to how much you might want it. Each player only has a limited amount of gold, so you'll want to be very careful with what you're bidding, because if you do end up winning the bid, you do get first choice as to which pair you want to take, but you're going to be losing all of that gold that you just bid. Whereas if you pass before that happens, then you're going to be getting half of your gold back. And it is pretty easy to keep track of all this with just 3 players, but they do also have these tokens here that you can take when you pass, so that you do know the order that you'll be drafting these cards. The gold is worth 3, the silver is worth 2, and of course the bronze is worth 1. And the player that gets to bid is the player to the left of the dealer, which means it would be this player's turn first. They might think that this pair looks really good and they don't want to get stuck with either of the other 2, so they might go ahead and throw in a gold to try and secure their lead. And then it's the next player's turn to decide whether they want to match, raise, or pass. Let's say that they decide to match, and then I also decide to match. And I'll just put this first player token over here so we don't get confused. And if the bid comes back to you and everyone else has matched, then you are forced to either raise or pass. Let's say they really want it, so they decide to put a silver into the bid. Then the next player might decide to pass, and like I said, when they do that, they get half of their bet back. But since a gold is worth 3, you're going to be rounding down, which means that they're going to be discarding that and just getting a bronze back, but they'll be taking the 3rd draft position. I'm pretty happy with saving some money and getting second choice, so I'm just going to do the same thing and pass, which means that I'll discard that and also get a bronze back. And then I get my 2nd draft position. And then the player that won discards all of their gold, but they do get first dibs here, and they're going to be taking these cards into their hand. Then I'll just go ahead and take these 2. Then the 3rd player would just get what remains. These tokens go back into the center, and then the draft continues like this until each player has 10 cards into their hand. And I've just fast forwarded to that point in the game, and I should mention that you would be passing the first player marker every time, changing the first player that does have to start the bidding. We also no longer need these tokens, so we can toss those to the side. And now we're going to be getting into the adventure phase, where you're going to be revealing a single quest here. Then each player is going to have the opportunity to add snakes from their party into that quest in order to try and be the player to claim it. Each of the quests is going to have a snake value in the bottom left, which indicates the maximum amount of snakes that you can contribute to that quest. And then a number of golden mice in the bottom right corner, which of course is your victory points. And that might also have some special rules or effects as well, and in this case it says that only rogues can be sent on this quest. This particular quest doesn't have a strength requirement in order to complete it, but it is going to be the player that does contribute the most strength that's going to be claiming that quest. Luckily, I do have 3 different rogue snakes I can choose from, and this one's pretty much free for me to play because it has a cooldown of 0, which means it's just going to be going straight back into my hand. So I'll definitely play that one, and then I guess I'll play my stronger of the other 2 in order to at least have a fighting chance here. This player only has 1 rogue, so they're going to go ahead and play that because they are forced to. Then after this player puts their 2 in, we're all going to be revealing our cards here, and then adding up the strength to see which player wins that quest. My snakes only have 20 strength, and this player beat me by just 1 point because they have 21, but none of that matters because this player played a snake of 28 strength, so they're going to be winning this quest and gaining those victory points. But their snake also has a cooldown of 4, which means that they're going to be putting it into the 4 slot on their board. Then, since mine has a cooldown of 0, it's just going to be going back into my hand. But this one does have a cooldown of 2, so it's going to be going there. And then this player's cards had a cooldown of 1 and 2. Now I'd pass the first player token, and then they're going to be revealing the next quest card, and it might not seem like player order matters all that much right now, but in this prototype version of the game, none of the snakes have any special abilities, but in the final version, it does look like they will be including those, and I'm really interested to see how that mixes up the gameplay, because it's really going to be adding another layer to decision making. But the way that the abilities resolve when those are in play is that it's going to be going in the same order as the player's turns. So in this prototype, the player order doesn't really matter, but it might matter in the final version. And this next quest does actually have a monster that you need to defeat, which means that you do need to have a minimum amount of strength in order to win that quest. Luckily, this one doesn't have any requirement as to the types of cards you can play, but it does have a limit of 3 cards. So I've just jumped forward here to where we've all selected our cards, and now we can go ahead and reveal them and determine which player actually wins the quest. This player actually played all low cards as a bluff, so they're just willing to lose this one in order to keep some of their better cards for a future quest. And I played a total of 52 strength, while this player played a total of 53, so they beat me by 1 point over again, and I didn't do that intentionally. So they win this card, but then all the cards that we currently have in our player board slide down to the next lowest number, and if it comes off the board, then it's going to be going back into your hand. But the game continues like this until you've completed those 10 quests, and then the player with the most victory points at the end of the game wins the game. And I really like the amount of decision making offered in this game for such a simple rule set, and they do have some variant rules as well if you want to go through the first phase of the game a little bit quicker. And I do think those ability cards are going to be adding a lot more into the game if you are looking for even more decision making. And if that's the case, you can find a link to the campaign in the description down below. Also on October 1st, we have the next entry being added to the Unmatched Adventures series, and this one is the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This is going to be adding all your favorite characters into the game, and there isn't a whole lot of info out for this campaign just yet, but I will have it linked down below if you do want to check it out. But I did cover Unmatched Adventures back when the original campaign launched, so if you want to know how the overall game plays, this is going to be adding more content into that system, and I'll just go ahead and roll that previous footage for you now. And this is going to be allowing players to play the Unmatched system cooperatively, which is a brand new way to play the game. And if you're not familiar with the Unmatched system, it's a head-to-head fight for dominance as you try to reduce your opponent's health down to 0. But one thing that's really interesting about this game is the wide selection of characters that the game offers. You can play as Medusa, King Arthur, dinosaurs from Jurassic Park, or even Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And what's also interesting about this is that you can actually just mix and match them all together and have wacky combinations where you have Bruce Lee against Little Red Riding Hood. You think I'm joking, but those are actual characters you can play in this game. But each character is going to come with their own deck of cards, and they can also come with multiple supporting characters as well. On a turn, players can take 2 actions from 3 possible actions. They can either choose to draw a card and optionally move their fighters, play a scheme card to perform its card's ability, or play an attack card to attack a valid target in range, and you're going to be resolving its effects, but that will also give your opponent the opportunity to play a defense card if they have one available. Of course, each of these character packs can also come with some different locations, which you can also mix and match across the games, and the first player to reduce their opponent's health down to 0 wins the game. And as I said, Unmatched Adventures is a brand new way to play the game, either cooperatively or solo, and the way that it does this is by introducing enemies into the mix. This first campaign is going to be offering you enemies like Mothman or Martian Invader, and players will be working together trying to defeat these enemies before they either complete their enemy objective or defeat all the players. Enemies will also come with their own deck of action cards, and that's going to determine the actions that they take on their turn as well as the movements that they make. There's also going to be a bunch of new heroes added into the mix as well, and you can use these heroes in the regular Unmatched game to play competitively, and you can also use all the existing heroes in the Unmatched Adventure to fight any of the villains. So these are completely combinable, and if you have the Unmatched system already, you can include all of your content into the Unmatched Adventures as long as you have even just a few of these enemies to fight. And if that sounds interesting to you, I have links in the description below. And also on October 1st, we have Vrahode, and this one's a really interesting one because it is a cooperative narrative adventure, but this one is also the first entry into their game system. And this one's going to be playing over a series of different scenarios, which are going to offer you different puzzles and monsters to fight. And it is designed to be a very challenging game, but this one is also designed to be an entry into that system. It's going to provide 24 different maps that you can play across, and it does act as a prologue for the core box, which will be released sometime next year. And if you do want to learn more about it, make sure to subscribe down below because I will cover it once it launches. But this version is not a watered-down version of that larger game. This one's going to be offering you a full comprehensive experience across different terrains and enemies and introducing different mechanisms. Something that I really like about this game is that it offers 24 different maps that you can play across, which is going to allow you to set up the different scenarios really quickly. But rather than offering this in a flip book or offering you maps that are made out of paper, each one of these is going to actually be a full-on board, allowing you to really get that immersion out on the table and to have that really high-quality feel. But of course, each player is going to be playing as their own unique character with their own stats, special abilities, and strengths and weaknesses. And you're going to have this hero dashboard to keep track of all of that. And it's designed to hold everything you need in order to keep track of your character and your character's developments. Players are going to be playing through the different scenarios, trying to complete their objectives and applying any specific rules for that scenario. And then players are going to be using their actions to explore a map, to investigate different points of interest, or gather tokens, or fight different enemies. And what's really cool about this game is that the battles actually take place on the same map that you're exploring, so you're not going to be doing combat on some separate board or anything like that. Once you run into an enemy and it's aware of you, it's going to be starting to try to attack you. In order to determine which order the enemies and the characters activate, you're going to be drawing for initiative and then comparing that amongst the different characters. And if you do find that it's more strategic to try and play your actions first, you can also spend that same resource that you use on your actions in order to bump up your initiative value. In order to attack or perform other actions, you may have to roll skill checks, and the skill that you're going to be checking against depends on the type of attack or action that you're doing. You're going to have some amount of base damage, but then the dice will actually modify that value, and of course adding any additional effects, either from strengths or weaknesses of the enemy, or any buffs that you might have applied to yourself. Players do also have the option to rest after a battle, which will allow you to regain your stats and action tokens, and you will also be able to draw a card from the rest deck, which is mostly good things, but there are also some different things that could happen that are not so good, like getting ambushed by more enemies. But the game continues like this as you play through those scenarios and discover the overarching story, and if this one does sound interesting to you, I will have it linked down below. Also on the first, we have Chivalry is Dead, Race for the Crown, and this one is a racing game where each player is going to be building up their own team of chariots of a specific race. And what's neat about this is the base game is going to have humans, goblins, dwarves, and kobolds, and each team's going to have their own unique stats and abilities, and there is going to be even more teams that you can add through expansions, but you'll be able to customize these chariots in a bunch of different ways. First of all, the boards just come with a few different abilities and stats off the bat, but then you can also add these different cards in order to customize them even more, which means that there is a lot of variability to this game, even if you are playing as the same team over again. Not only that, but there's a lot of variability with the actual racetrack itself because players are going to be combining the racetrack with a bunch of different tokens like obstacles and traps. And this is going to be adding variability because the players do have the freedom to place the tokens however they like, bearing some restrictions. But of course, to win the game, you want to be the first player to cross the finish line after completing a certain amount of laps. And as you're trying to get around these different obstacles, you're also going to have to worry about the other players getting in your way because you can attack each other. And there is ways that you can mitigate this through using your control points, but those are only going to get reset once you complete a lap, so you have a limited amount of those that you can use each and every lap. But the game plays over a series of rounds where each player is going to be choosing their speed in secret on their speed dial, staying within their maximum speed. This is going to determine the amount of base movement points that you get for that round, but you can also get additional movement points by spending a control point, which will allow you to roll a die to give you a random amount of extra movement. Turn order is determined by a deck which has cards for each player. You're going to be shuffling those and then drawing one card at a time to determine the order that the players get to activate. You're going to be spending your movement points to either move forwards or sideways along the track, and there are some areas on the board that do have speed limits, and if you end up taking more movement than the limit on that speed limit, then you're going to be taking damage equal to the difference. Once again, you can use control points to mitigate this. Something that's neat about this game and makes it unique from a lot of other racing games is that your chariot's actually going to be occupying 2 spaces out on the board because your chariot's divided into the actual carriage and then the horses that are pulling it. If you ever line up your chariot next to another player so that some portion of your opponent's chariot lines up with your carriage, then you can actually attack that player, attacking either the horses or their carriage depending on what's next to you. Depending on whether you attack the horses, the chariot, or the driver itself, this could limit the abilities that they have access to, reduce their max speed, or even destroy the chariot completely, causing debris out on the racetrack that you'll also have to avoid. But if you do roll a 1, that's going to be causing a critical fail, and of course the other player is going to be able to get a counterattack. Luckily, you do have other chariots if you do end up losing any of yours, so likely you will be able to remain in the game, but the game continues like this until one player crosses that finish line first, and then they win the game. And if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. Also launching on the 1st, we have Twisted Cryptids, which is the next game coming from Unstable Games, which is the same team that brought you Unstable Unicorns, along with a bunch of other party games. But the thing about this publisher is that they don't really release too much about their games before they are released, so I don't really have too much info on this one. So if you do want to learn more about it, they do have a bit of info on their website, but it doesn't really tell you much about the game. But you can sign up either on their website or follow along on the Kickstarter itself in order to get notified once it launches. And I will have a link to that in the description down below. Also launching on the 1st, we have Citizens of Spark, and this one is a competitive tableau builder where the cards that you collect are actually going to be granting you the actions that you have for your turn. What's really interesting about this game is that there are a bunch of different types of cards that you can include in the game. You're going to be choosing 7 to 10 of them to play for that specific game, which is going to create a ton of variety from game to game. But once you've chosen the cards you're going to be playing with, you're going to be combining those into a single deck, and then each player is going to get 2 to start their tableau. You're then going to be drawing from that deck in order to build up the main display, which is going to be made up of multiple rows. The reason that these rows are important is because on your turn, you're going to be choosing one of those rows to add into your tableau. The rows that you don't choose are going to get a spark token added to them, which is a victory point at the end of the game. So it does make a row that's not chosen over multiple turns worth more and more as that continues. But after you've chosen your row and added those cards into your tableau, you'll then be able to optionally activate any one ability in the cards that you have. What's neat about this is that not only is there a ton of different actions offered in this game, but the more that you get of the same card, you're going to be stacking those cards together, and it's going to be upgrading the action that you get from it. The different actions could grant you spark tokens, which, like I said, are victory points in this game, but they could also do other things like modify your cards in different ways, allowing you to trade cards in, gain more cards, or even discard certain cards in order to gain more spark tokens. The actions could also become even more powerful depending on other cards that you have in your tableau and the different icons that they might have, and they could also allow you to steal sparks or cards from other players, but if you don't like any amount of take that in your games, you can just choose not to play with those cards. But once you do activate a card, you're then going to be going around each player clockwise, and then each other player is also going to have the opportunity to activate that same card if they do have it in their tableau. This means that you do care which cards the other players have, because if you have similar cards, that might get you some free actions. But the game continues like this until that deck runs out, and then the player with the most victory points at the end of the game, either from the sparks that they gathered throughout or from completing those endgame objectives, is the winner of the game. And if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. Also on the first, we have StarDriven Gateway, where players are captains controlling their own starship. And this is a game that offers a bunch of different scenarios that can all play very different from each other, and some of them can offer either cooperative, competitive, or even solo play. And each of them are going to be offering their own objectives that you're going to be trying to complete in order to gain victory points. Players are going to be using actions in order to explore space, revealing tiles, visiting planets, completing missions where they might have to spend crew or resources to do so, but you can also do things like discover anomalies, which are cards with special effects, and they're usually positive but can be negative if you haven't properly equipped for them. Of course, there's also some space combat to be had, and you're going to be fighting enemy ships using dice rolling, and the amount of dice that you get to roll depends on the charges that you've prepped your ship with. And the way that you prepare for all these actions is by loading up your shipboard, because each player is going to have their own shipboard, and you're going to be rolling different types of dice that you'll be able to assign to the different locations in order to be able to activate that station. But also, in order to activate it, you do need a crew member at that station. And each of the different spaces requires a different type of die in order to activate it, and you only have a limited number of each type of die. So you're going to have to pick and choose where you might want to assign those. Crew members do also act as a bit of a resource, as you do need them to activate the different stations, but then there are different objectives and missions where you might lose or trade them in order to complete different objectives. Unfortunately, I don't know too much more on the finer details of the game, so if you want to learn more about the gameplay, you'll have to check out the campaign for yourself, but I will have that linked down below. Also on the first, we have Estate Raise the Realm, and this one is a competitive worker placement game where each player is going to be playing as a different character with different abilities, and each of you are going to have a number of trackers which are going to track either the number of cards you can activate in a single turn, the number of cards you're allowed to draw for a single draw action, or the number of actions that will be accessible to you, because some of the actions out on the board you do need to unlock by raising the amount that you have on that tracker. But the game plays over 5 rounds, with each round representing a different era, and at the start of each of these, you're going to be drawing a era event card. This is going to have some game-changing effects or objectives for players to try and accomplish, and you're going to be taking turns just placing one worker at a time in order to take the various actions. There's action spaces on your personal player board as well as the main player board, but some of the actions will allow you to draw estate cards either from the market or from the estate deck at random, or you could play an action in order to pay the cost in order to play an estate card. And these can do different things like increase your progress on these various tracks or even grant you some bonus actions that you can use later. But some of those cards are also production cards, and you're going to be adding those to your board, but you do need to use an action in order to activate those, and those will allow you to gain the resources or cards or anything else that they might generate. But the action locations out on the main board can also present you with different resources, and these are accumulating, so each time that action space isn't used, more resources are going to be added, making it more and more valuable in order to take that action. Of course, you're trying to do all this in order to gain those resources that you need to convert into victory points, either throughout the game or by completing those different objectives. Then the player with the most victory points at the end of the game wins the game. Also on October 1st, we have Circle the Wagons: The Second Shot, and this is a standalone expansion to the original game Circle the Wagons, and this can be played on its own or combined with that original game. And when you do combine it, you have 2 different ways that you can play it. You can either just shuffle all the cards together, and since you're going to have twice as many cards. You're just going to be drawing half of them in order to set up a regular game, but this is going to allow more variety in that game since you do have twice as many cards that could be involved. The other variant is to do the exact same thing. You're going to be shuffling all the cards together, but then you're going to be splitting it into 2 decks, and you're going to be playing the game over 2 rounds. And if you're not familiar with this game, I can just go ahead and show you how it plays because the publisher was kind enough to send me a copy here. And like all the other Button Shy games, this is a game that's going to be doing quite a lot with very few cards, and all these cards just fit into a nice little wallet-sized package that makes it very portable and easy to take around with you. Encircle the Wagons is made up of 18 double-sided cards. On one side, you're going to have some sort of objective, and on the other side, you're going to have a bunch of different territories represented by these different colors, and then different icons randomized across those territories. The neat thing here is that when you set up the game, you just shuffle the cards, and then the first 3 that you draw, you're going to be putting on their objective side, which is going to add some unique objectives from game to game. And then for all the remaining cards, you don't worry about the objectives on the other side. You're just going to be using them for their territories. This is a game that can be played both solo or as a 2-player game, and for this run through, I'm going to be showing you the 2-player mode. The way the game works is that players are going to be taking turns drafting cards from the outer circle here, trying to use those cards in order to achieve these 3 different objectives. Whichever player goes first, the opposing player gets to decide which card they need to start with. So let's say my opponent told me to start with this card. This gap here now represents the starting location for the next card that needs to be drafted, and you can draft any card in the circle, but any cards that you skip over automatically go to your opponent. Since my opponent told me to pick up this card, then they would likely want this next card, so they're just going to go ahead and draft that one. This means that the draft would now come back to me, but before I draft my next card, it's important for me to understand the different objectives that I'm trying to accomplish here. The first one is the frozen assets, which allows the player with the largest group of snow terrain to choose a symbol that's going to be scoring for each of the players. This means that not only do I really want this card because it has a lot of snow on it, but I also want to try and get the most of a particular icon so that I'm not giving as many points to my opponent. The next objective is the Ghost Town, which allows us to score points per unique symbol in our largest group of desert terrain, and depending on the amount you have, you're going to get a different amount of victory points. Then the final objective is the Snow Caps, which gives you 2 points per snow territory in the top of each of the columns. This objective could possibly work very well with this first one if we do play smart. And because the snow is such a big deal in this particular game, I think I'm going to go ahead and skip over these 2 cards in order to draft this one. And anytime you draft a card, you have to place it so that it's either positioned adjacent to another territory, or you can also overlap a territory or even overlap multiple territories. This first card didn't do a whole lot for me, but I think I'm going to leave those icons open just because the icons could possibly score me points for the Frozen Assets objective if I am able to maintain control of the snow territories. But because I skipped both of those 2 cards, my opponent has to take both of these and they don't have a choice. They have to add it into their town. This isn't terrible for them because they can start building out their desert a little bit more. This other card doesn't do a whole lot for them, but it might help for icons later, so they'll just go ahead and throw that over there. But now it's my opponent's turn to draft a card, and they're making good progress on the desert here, so they're going to want another desert card, and this one actually has 2 desert terrain on it, so they're going to take this one. Then what they're going to do is add it right above this card in order to join those together, and they might hope to get a card later that will be able to join these. But it is nice here because it does also have the snow terrain at the top here, which will score them for the snow caps. Because they skipped over this card, it's going to be going into my tableau, so I get to decide where I want to put that. And I should note that you are allowed to flip these over, which I think I'm going to do here, which is going to allow me to combine these snow terrains together, making that group even bigger. And now the gameplay comes back to me, and I really don't want my opponent to get this card because I think their deserts are big enough. I don't want them to get any bigger, so I'm going to skip over these 2 cards, which does mean I am sacrificing some snow terrain, but I feel like I am pretty far ahead on that, so I'm okay with my opponent getting a few snow cards into their supply. But what I'll do is add this card down here, which is going to create a nice big group of desert for me, each with a different icon, which is exactly what I need to score as much points as possible. But then my opponent is going to be getting these 2 cards. There's not a whole lot they can do with these other than maybe put them like that to at least get 2 of those at the top and score for this snow cap here. But now it's their turn, and they're just going to go ahead and draft this next card here, which does allow them to position that over this card, connecting all that desert together. For myself, I'll just go ahead and grab this next card here, which will allow me to score another snow cap, and I'm not too worried about them catching up to me on the frozen assets. But my opponent really wants this card because it's going to allow them to not only score more points in their desert terrain, but it also does earn them a snow cap at the same time. So that means I'll be taking the remaining 2, and I can put them anywhere I want. This one doesn't do a whole lot for me. I can combine it with my desert, but I already have that icon in there. Then this one will allow me to score another snow cap if I position it like so. Now that all cards have been drafted, you're going to be going through each of these different objectives and tallying up the total score for each player. And then the player with the highest amount of victory points, which was definitely me, wins the game. But before I wrap up on this one, I'll just show you a few of the other objectives that you could possibly draw in this game. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of variety that use all the different icons and all the different terrains, and the different combinations of these different objectives will change your games drastically. And if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked in the description down below. Also launching on the 1st, we have a new upgraded version of Pax Porfiriana, and this is going to feature much nicer artwork than that original game. It's also going to feature upgraded components, and it's actually all going to fit into a smaller box, and it's going to maintain that portability that the original game had. But if you're not familiar with this game, this is a game where players are building up their business empires while also sending over different bandits and police in order to try and shut down their opponents. Each game's going to have 4 different cards that players are going to be using for scoring, but it can also dictate other aspects of the game as well, such as production, and those cards are also dictated by the current form of government. So if the players are able to influence the government and change things up, you can actually change these cards out throughout the game. The goal of this game is to be the player with the most money at the end of it, and the game plays over a series of rounds, where at the start of each round, players are going to be going through an action phase, performing 3 possible actions. There's going to be a main display of different cards that are going to be cycling each turn, knocking some of those off and putting them into the discard, but players will be able to use their actions in order to gain those cards, play those cards that they already have, or speculate on some of the cards that they think other players might purchase. If a player does purchase those cards and you speculated on it, then that's going to allow you to get the money for that rather than the bank. The different cards can represent different enterprises that gain you income in different markets, units that protect your assets or attack other enterprises, or they could also be public events that provide effects or bonuses to all the players, or even regime cards that can affect the political landscape. Depending on the different types of enterprises that you build, you can also use actions to buy land for those enterprises, and there is also actions that allow you to deploy your various troops. After you've performed your 3 actions, the market's then going to cycle, like I mentioned, and then depending on the cards that get discarded as a result of that, it could either put that game in or out of a depression. Some players might actually benefit from the game going into a depression depending on the enterprises that they have, but at the end of your turn, you're going to be collecting gold for the different cubes that you have in play, and then if it is in a depression currently, you're going to be paying 1 gold for each card that you have in play. Of course, there's a lot more to this game, and I just went through it with the broad strokes, so if you do want to learn more about this one, there are videos on the campaign page already, and of course, since this is a game that's already out there, you can find videos on YouTube or on the BGG page as well, and you can find a link to the campaign in the description down below. Also on the 1st, we have Girls vs. Ghouls, and this one is a deduction party game where players are secretly either on the girls team or on the ghouls team. And the way this game's set up is that you're going to have 8 different flippable houses out on the main board, and each of the houses' sides are going to represent either the girls faction or the ghouls faction. Players will be trying to control the different houses and get them flipped over to their side. And then at the end of each round, the trick-or-treaters are going to be visiting the house with the most candy, gaining points to the team that has control over that house. You should also take note that the house with the least candy is going to be flipped to its opposing side, automatically losing you control over that house. But to play the game, each player is going to be maintaining a hand of cards, and you're going to be redrawing up to your hand limit at the end of each turn. but on your turn you can choose one of 3 possible actions. You could either take the treat action, which allows you to play candy to a house, and this is public information. Some types of candy might add to the value of that house, while some types of candy are less desirable and could subtract from that value. But the other action you can perform is the trick action, and this allows you to play a modifier card or an effect card to one of the many houses, and these are revealed at the end of the round. But if you do want to see it earlier in the game, then you can take the sneak peek action. That's going to allow you to look at one of those trick cards, which will also give you additional information as to who might be on your team, depending on who played that card and what exactly it's going to be affecting for that house. Each player also starts the game with a hidden talent card that will give you some sort of special ability, but it's only going to get revealed once you actually use it, so it is something that you can keep up your sleeve, at least for a while. But the game continues like this, with players trying to control the houses with the most candy at the end of each round in order to score the most points, and then the team with the most victory points at the end of the game wins the game. Also launching on the 1st, we have Mischief, and this one is a team-based game where players are trying to build up their friendships with the appropriate factions in order to win favor with the king and queen, and therefore victory points at the end of the game. Each team's dealt a hand of faction cards at the beginning of the game, and then you're going to be playing those cards onto the main board to the appropriate factions table with each of these different columns representing each of those tables. But one team's going to be playing their cards to the bottom half of the board while the other team plays their cards to the top. What you're trying to do is have the most influence on your side of that table in order for that faction to favor you. But as players are taking turns playing these cards to their side of the board, what they're trying to do is trigger different events to happen, because if you're able to get a card into play on your side of the board that is also in sequential order with another card on your side of the board, then the lower valued card is going to be protecting the higher valued one. This is nice because it's now protected, which I'll explain in a second here, but it also gains you a friendship token which can earn you victory points at the end of the game. The reason that you want your cards protected is because if your opponent plays the same type of card of the same value on their side of the board and your card is not protected, then yours is going to get discarded, and then they also get a prank token which can be used for tiebreakers at the end of the game. After you've played a card, you can also optionally swap one of your cards with one of the cards out in one of the invitation rows. And if the card you played was also valued from 1 to 5, that could also add more cards into the invitational areas, giving you more opportunities and options when you do swap your cards. But players continue doing this back and forth until you have just 5 cards left in your hand. Then at that point, you're going to be discarding one of your cards, and then the remaining 4 cards that you have left are going to be scoring you based on how they align with the cards that are already in play out on the board. This means that throughout the game, you're going to be playing your cards trying to make certain factions the most influential, but then you're also going to want to maintain some of those cards in your hand to hold back so that you can score against those factions at the end of the game. You'll be combining those points with any of the tokens that you were able to gain throughout the game, and the player with the most victory points at the end wins the game. Also on the 1st, we have Smoothie Wars, and this one is a competitive game where players are going to be selling smoothies over 7 days, and the player with the most money at the end wins the game. The way that a day plays is that you're essentially going to be deciding what amount of smoothies you're selling and for what price in each of the 4 different regions. Each of these regions are then going to have some amount of demand, which is going to dictate how many smoothies will sell in that region, but the players selling their smoothies at the lowest price are going to be selling their smoothies first. This means that if you price yours too high and there's not enough demand there, you might not end up selling anything, whereas if you don't end up having a whole lot of competition in that region, you could sell your smoothies for quite a lot. There are also some other factors that can dictate the amount of demand in a region, because you will be rolling dice in order to determine the weather, which could affect that demand. But like I said, the game plays over 7 rounds, then the player with the most money at the end of the game wins the game. Also on the 1st, we have Mythlords Classic Monsters, and this one is an area control game where players are going to be controlling their faction of monsters. And this one's returning to Kickstarter along with the miniatures, but I did cover this one back when it originally launched, but it got pulled down and it's relaunching now. So if you do want to learn more about this one, I'll just go ahead and roll that previous footage for you now. And this is a competitive area control game and deck building game where players are going to be deploying different units, fighting the other players, and trying to take control over different locations. But the way this game works is that each player is going to be choosing a commander from one of the 4 supernatural factions, and then each faction is going to have its own sanctum where players are going to be keeping track of their health and victory points, but it's also where they're going to be building up their armies and equipping them before sending them out to battle. There's going to be a bunch of different units that players can draw from their deck, and each of these could have different stats for their health and their strength, as well as their power generation, which is the currency used to pay for other cards or potential actions throughout the game. But they could each have different skills and keywords that might interact with skills in different ways, as well as a passive power and a power that you'll have to trigger either through a certain event or by paying in order to activate it. Not a whole lot more info on this one at the time of me filming this video, but the players will be deploying their units, trying to take control over the different location cards and trying to defeat their opponents, because the player who's able to gain the most victory points from doing all that is going to be the winner of the game. And if you want to learn more about this one, I will have it linked in the description down below. Also on the first, we have Valheim the board game, and this one is of course a cooperative adventure game that's based on the video game with the same name. So of course you will see a lot of similarities with the board game to what you have seen in the video game. You're going to be accomplishing some of those same goals, like building and developing out your character and specializing in different skills. And you're going to be using actions in order to explore, collect resources, forge weapons and gear, build your base, and battle a series of enemies, eventually defeating the final bosses, which you'll have to summon by accomplishing different objectives. The game allows you to just pick and choose which scenarios you want to play, or you could play through them as a campaign, or you could even build your own. The scenarios in this game are going to be based around a unique mission with different setup and objectives and modifications to the rule set, but the way that players actually play the game is on their turn they're going to be able to spend 3 action points to move around on the board and reveal new tiles, which can also reveal different points of interest or monsters or creatures that will spawn out on the board. And if the tile has different resources on it, you can use an action to roll dice in order to harvest those, but the dice can also generate noise, and if there are monsters around, it will attract them from those nearby tiles. Of course, you can also use actions to interact with other points of interest, like different treasures you might find, different types of creatures, traveling merchants, special items needed for mission objectives, or even activating those boss altars in order to trigger the final battles. Combat in this game is also done through dice rolling, but I don't have a whole lot of info on that. But in between turns, players will be drawing an event card, which can have all sorts of different effects, modifying actions, repopulating creatures or monsters out on the board, or even causing different negative effects. There's not a whole lot more info at the time of me filming this video, but if you do want to learn more about this, I will have a link to the campaign in the description down below, where I'm sure they'll have a bunch more details once the campaign actually launches. And if you're watching this one early enough, you can follow along, which will also get you a free gift added to your pledge. Also on the first, we have Flip Dynasty, and this one is a game where players act as general managers to a baseball team, and at the start of the game you're going to be choosing the team that you're going to be managing, which is going to be granting you some sort of special abilities, but it's also going to dictate the amount of budget that you have to spend throughout the entirety of the game. You're also going to be hiring a manager to your team, which will also grant you with another ability, but this one will usually come at the cost of assigning a die in order to activate that ability, which I will come back to later. But of course you're going to need players for your team, and at the start of each round, each player is going to be dealt a hand of cards, and then you're going to be going through a drafting phase where you can choose one of those cards and then pass the remaining cards to the next player. Or instead, if there's no cards there that you want to draft to your team, you can instead choose to discard one of those cards from the game so that no other players can get it. Some of these cards are going to be major league players that can just go straight into your team, while others are prospects that aren't quite ready for the big leagues, and you're going to have to wait until the following round until you're able to add those into your team. Of course, each of these players do also cost you some amount of money, and you're going to have to pay that to add them to your team. And then any players that you keep on your team, you're either going to have to pay them more the following rounds, or choose to cut them from your team, which will allow you to get some of that money back. But each of these cards are going to have different positions, as well as different amounts of blue dice that they could grant you, or different amounts of red dice. And each of them will also have dice placement locations on the bottom of the card, requiring a certain number of dice of a certain icon. If you're able to fill all those locations and then also match the appropriate icons, it's going to get you their max amount of wins on the right side of the card. But if you're able to just fill them up without matching the icons, then it's going to be granting you with the left amount of wins. And the goal is to try and get the most wins each round so that you can gain a trophy, but also to try and get over 16 wins because that can also grant you another trophy. But the way this works is once all the players have created their teams, each player is going to be checking how many blue dice their cards grant them, and then you're going to be taking that amount of dice and rolling them, and then assigning them to the different locations on your cards. Each of the cards can have some special abilities that could help them or their team in different ways, so you do want to be taking advantage of those as well anytime that you can. But after all the players have assigned their dice, you're all going to be checking how many red dice are on your cards, and then you're going to be contributing all of those dice into a common pool, where all the players are then going to be taking turns drafting from. You'll be using those dice to fill up any remaining spaces on your various cards, and then all the players will just tally up the number of wins for that round and then take the appropriate amount of trophies. You'll also want to make sure that you're getting players of different positions because you can only include the wins from one player from each position. But the game continues like this over a series of rounds with players adding and removing different players from their team. And then the player with the most trophies at the end of the game wins the game, and if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. Also on the first, we have Doomcat, and this one is a roll and write, but I also just found out about it as I was filming this video, so I wasn't able to look into this one in quite as much detail as all the other games here. But what I was able to gather really quickly while filming this is that this is a game where every round there's going to be 3 dice rolled, and then you're going to be choosing 2 of those dice in order to draw a line between 2 candles on your sheet. And you're going to be doing this to try and complete different objectives and unlock different special powers. But the die that you didn't pick also matters because it's going to be eliminating that candle from your sheet, making it no longer accessible for the game, which means that as the game goes on, your sheet is going to get tighter and tighter with fewer and more difficult options to make. If you're able to connect lines so that they can enclose other candles, that's going to allow you to draw another line for free. And each game is going to have 2 or 3 different scoring objectives that you're trying to achieve, and the player who has the most victory points at the end of it all wins the game. And launching on October 2nd, we have ULTRAMASSIVE, and this one is a competitive game where players are playing as black holes, trying to consume as much matter and antimatter as possible in order to increase their mass, to increase your gravitational pull, draw in even more mass and matter, to just become as big as possible because it's the player with the most mass at the end of the game that's going to be the winner. To start the game, each player is going to have a hand of action cards as well as their own black hole board with 2 different paths that you're going to be drawing in different celestial bodies and different types of matter into your orbit in order to consume and just make yourself more massive. As you do that, you're going to be increasing your solar mass out on the victory point board, but this board is also used for players to take their main actions each round because this is a game that plays over 6 rounds, and to start the round, you're going to be drafting actions from this board. There's 2 different drafts that players are going to be going through, and to do that, you're going to be taking your colored action token and then assigning it to one of the actions below those tokens. These actions can do different things like assign different types of matter to your board, and the number of dots on these different tokens represent the amount of mass that they're going to be adding to your black hole if you're able to get that matter to the center of your board. Normally when you add matter this way, it's going to get added to the number 1 space on your board, but you can choose whether you want it to be on the blue path or the red path. But if you choose to instead add antimatter to your board, it's going to be going onto your board the exact same way, but the other players are going to be forced to add a smaller amount of antimatter to their boards. This could be bad for them because if they are forced to put it in a space where other matter already exists, anytime that antimatter and matter come in contact, they're both going to be eliminated. The nice thing about antimatter is that there are certain locations on your board with the antimatter icon, and if you're able to orbit the antimatter to that space, it's just going to be going straight into your black hole, skipping over all the remaining spaces that regular matter would have to follow through. But another action does allow you to orbit the matter on your board, moving both your matter and antimatter 1 space clockwise down the different paths. And finally, there's actions that allow you to move up on your discovery track on the bottom of your board. This discovery track essentially acts as a resource that you'll be able to spend throughout the remainder of the round, as well as optionally at the end of the round to convert some of that into solar mass. After all the players have drafted their actions, you're then going to be able to take additional actions by each player then having a turn where they can spend their discovery track in order to buy anomaly cards. And the anomaly cards come in 3 different types, and they're going to be located on the side of the board there. And if you are able to purchase those, then those will grant you some sort of passive ability, allowing you to build up a bit of an engine as the game goes on. But you can also use those action cards that you were dealt at the start of the game in order to take additional actions, and you will be able to redraw back up to your hand limit of 3 at the end of the round. But the last thing you can do on your turn is activate any of the wormholes out on your board, and all the players start with 2 wormholes on each of the different orbit paths. And when you activate a wormhole, any of the matter or antimatter located on that space is going to be automatically moved to the other space. The only catch here is that when you do that, that wormhole is going to be closing until you do reach a certain round in the game, because between rounds 2 and 3, all the wormholes will open again, and then also again between rounds 4 and 5, so you are incentivized to use these. As you get enough mass into the black hole, it's going to be moving you through different thresholds, which actually allow you to add a bigger black hole token onto your board, which is actually going to cover up some of the different orbital locations, making it easier to get mass into the black hole from that point forward. But the game continues like this, and the most massive player at the end of the 6 rounds wins the game. And if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. And also on the second, we have a competitive team-based word game. And the way this game works is that each team is going to be given a selection of letter tiles at the beginning of the game, and then you're going to be using those tiles in order to create a crossword in front of you. You're going to be gaining points for creating enclosed spaces, but every round there's going to be a new tile drawn for each of the players on the team. You're going to have 30 seconds to add those tiles into your crossword, and you are allowed to move and adjust the existing tiles. You're going to be trying to complete different objectives to score extra victory points throughout each round, because each round will offer a different specific letter that you'll gain victory points for using. You'll also gain additional points for spelling a specific word or creating words within a specific category. There's also a bonus 5 points for whichever team can create the longest word, and then at the end of the rounds, the team that has the most points wins the game. And if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. And launching on October 3rd, we have Sibille, and this one is a competitive game where players are fortune tellers trying to read the fortunes of their various customers in order to try and complete different objectives in order to win the game. Each player is going to have their own deck of tarot cards that they're going to be using to take their actions, and you're also going to have your own player board where you're going to be keeping track of your different resources and also any of the customers that you're able to attract, because there are going to be different customers appearing throughout the game, and certain customers are going to be attracted to the players who have the most fame or the most power, which you'll be tracking around the perimeter of this board, or they might be attracted to the player that has the most of one of the different types of resources. Each game is going to have 4 randomized objectives that players can try to complete, and the first player that's able to complete 2 of those objectives is going to be the one to win the game. This is a game that plays over a series of rounds where at the start of each round, players are going to be simultaneously selecting 3 cards from their deck of tarot cards and putting them face down in front of them. These are the actions that you're going to be performing for your turn, but players are also going to be choosing 3 cards at the start of the game to put face down in front of them, and these are predictions of which actions you think the other players are going to take. This is because after all the players have chosen their cards, you're then going to be taking turns revealing your 3 cards and then taking the associated actions, but if any other player reveals a card that is the same as one of the cards that you predicted, that's going to allow you to gain one of the gem resources, which you can hang on to try to have the most of to attract customers, or you can spend them to get an upgraded version of the action on one of your tarot cards. The different actions on your tarot cards can allow you to do different things like gain the different resources of the different types, increase your fame or your power, which you're going to be tracking around the perimeter of the main board. And anytime that you pass one of these dice that are around the perimeter as well, you're going to also gain the benefit of that die. Different tarot cards can also affect the customer pool in various ways, swapping customers out or adding or removing customers. Then there's also actions that can allow you to buy artifact or trinket cards, which can give you instant or passive effects, or they might just grant you bonuses for meeting certain conditions. But once all the players have performed their actions, you're then going to be checking the customers in the main customer pool, and then depending on their color, they're going to be attracted to each of the players depending on who best fulfills their requirement. Players will be attracting those customers, spending their resources and gathering resources, all to try and meet two of those different objectives. And then the first player that does that wins the game, and if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. And that's finally everything I have for you this week, but you definitely don't want to be leaving yet because we got a bunch of awesome pledge giveaways here, and most of these are going to be offered worldwide, which means that anyone can feel free to enter, and all you got to do is leave a comment down below. Plus, we do run giveaways like this pretty much every single week throughout the entirety of the year. And when I say that, it does sound crazy, and maybe it is, but there is a lot of opportunities to both stay up to date with all the campaigns that are launching and also get your hands on some really nice free pledges here. So subscribing does have its perks. And the first few here are going to be offered worldwide, and the first one we have is both the Skara, Brae, and the Anarchy games, so whoever wins this one is actually going to be getting two really awesome games. Skara, Brae is a worker placement game where you're going to be building up your village and generating different resources and converting those into other resources. But the cool mechanism here is that as you generate those resources, and the more resources you do generate, you're also going to be generating a certain amount of waste. You're going to want to try and mitigate that because it is also worth negative points at the end of the game. And there are actions that allow you to get rid of it, but while you're doing all of this, you're also going to be building up a bit of a tableau depending on the villagers you add and the different components to your village that you draft from the card drafting portion of this game. And those cards are going to be adding different icons and actions that you'll be able to take advantage of to build up a little bit of an engine as the game moves forward. The Anarchy is quite a bit of a different game that also looks really, really fun because in this game you're going to be drafting cards that are going to be granting you different amount of resources and workers. And you're going to be taking those and spending them on your turn, but the card you draft is also going to be dictating your scoring objectives that you're going to be trying to fulfill throughout the entirety of the game. This is a game that also uses a pen and paper where you'll be able to spend those resources in order to upgrade your castle, reinforce it with different troops or traps, and defend against the oncoming attacks that are going to happen each and every round. And like I mentioned, this giveaway is going to be getting the winner of both of these games, so I'm going to be super jealous of whoever wins here, but all you got to do is leave a comment down below, and you can say anything that you want. This next one is also for another awesome one, and I just want to thank the publisher here, first off, for creating such an awesome game, but then second of all, for offering such an awesome giveaway, because this one is going to be for an all-in pledge, which is going to get you everything for this game, including all the upgraded components and expansion add-ons, and also everything for the original game as well. This one's a cooperative game where players are going to be playing as different angels that can be customized in a whole bunch of different ways, and players are going to be fighting back against all sorts of demons, trying to defeat those demons and make their way to defeating all of the fallen princes. A neat mechanism in this game that makes it even harder is that every round you're going to be trying to rescue different people out on the board that are influenced by these demons, and for each one that remains under their influence, you're going to be adding these different cards to your board. But if the board is already full of those cards, then you're going to be starting to flip them over, which are going to cause all sorts of negative effects. This means that you're going to be using your actions not only to defeat those various demons, but also to try and rescue those people and to get rid of as much of those cards as possible. This is another one that I'm super interested in, and I'm going to be very jealous of whoever wins this one, but same thing here. This one is offered worldwide, which is just awesome of the publisher to do that, and all you got to do to enter this giveaway is leave a comment down below. And this next one is also offered worldwide, and this one is for Snow Planner and the new expansion. And this one is a worker placement game where players are going to be building up their own ski resorts. This game actually uses dice worker placement, which does also happen to be one of my favorite mechanisms, but you're going to be using those dice workers in order to fulfill the different needs of your different visitors and try to complete all sorts of different objectives throughout the game. This giveaway is going to be for the base game as well as the new expansion, and just like the previous giveaways, all you got to do is leave a comment down below. And all these giveaways just happen to be for games that I'm super interested in, and the next one is DinoGenics New Arrivals. And if you're not familiar with this game, this is a worker placement game where you're going to be using your workers to collect dino DNA, attract people to your theme park, and actually build up your theme park in order to house the different dinos that you'll be creating. The neat thing about this game is that each of the dinosaurs are going to have different requirements that need to be met for them to stay happy and healthy within your park. But fulfilling those requirements are mostly optional, and if you don't fulfill them, you just have to deal with the consequences of some of your visitors possibly getting eaten and some of your park possibly getting destroyed. Of course, that's only a possibility, so it might be in your best interest to push your luck and try to get a little bit more into your park than what might be reasonable. And this is another one that is basically offered worldwide. This one's going to be available to North America, the UK, the EU, Australia, and New Zealand. So if you're in any of those regions, feel free to enter and just leave the hashtag Dino on your comments so that I know you are good for this one. And the last giveaway we have here is for a pledge for Ice and Idols, and this one is really interesting because it's a pick up and deliver game that takes place on a constantly changing board. The board can actually rotate and different parts of it can shift and move around. And at some points the game's going to be doing this, and at other points the players are going to be doing that in order to try and tip the scales in their favor. Players are going to be using their actions in order to move around on the board and try and collect different idols, which you can then trade in to complete different objectives or to power up your character with new abilities. And this giveaway is going to get you a copy of the game as well as the Kickstarter bonus character and tiles. And all you got to do to enter this one is leave a comment down below with the hashtag ICE. Just keep in mind that this one is only offering free shipping to North America, but if you are really interested in this one and you still want to enter, feel free to do so. You'll just have to cover the shipping to whichever region you are located in. Good luck in the giveaways, but now let's go ahead and draw the winners from last week's giveaways, and we had Dungeons of the Oak Dell, LUDOS, the Ancient Games Collection for Africa, as well as a pledge for Railroad Tiles. To draw a winner, I use this fancy application here, and all these extra names down here are bonus entries for my subscribers over on Ko-fi. These videos do take a massive amount of effort researching all these games, filming and editing, and also just running all these giveaways and coordinating it all with the various publishers, and it's these members on Ko-fi that are making all of this just a little bit more sustainable for me, so I do appreciate it a lot. And the first one we're going to draw for is Dungeons of the Oak Dell, so let's go ahead and draw that winner. And the winner is Joshua Sanderson from Ko-fi. I'll reach out to you and let you know that you won yourself a pledge here. Next, we're going to draw for LUDOS Africa, so we'll just do the exact same thing here. And the winner is Anders J. Dissing, also from Ko-fi, so I'll reach out to you and let you know that you won yourself a sweet pledge here. And finally, let's draw the winner for Railroad Tiles, which is going to be Amsum2112, and they say, thanks for introducing me to the games by LUDOS. I went down a long rabbit hole looking at all the ones they have available. I have also been down that rabbit hole many times, so it is nice to have company, but you're welcome. And also I just want to thank you for tuning in and joining in on the fun here. I'm happy to be able to get another game added to your shelf. Just email me at adam@shelfclutter.com and we'll get that pledge all sorted out. That's everything for this week. Another week of an insane amount of games. And I did realize while I was filming this that I forgot to call out which games are the Discord picks of the week, and there are multiple this week because we have both Unmatched Adventures and Citizens of Spark, both tied for first here. Hopefully there were some games there that you found interesting as well. There's already 15 games lined up for next week, and then I have 11 games lined up for the week after that, and we are still early here, so there's going to be a lot more added to those weeks, so it doesn't look like we're slowing down anytime soon. I hope you like lots and lots of board games because there's a ton more on the way, but until then, thanks so much for tuning in, and until next time, keep that shelf cluttered and the table full.
Oh.